The conference room smells like burnt coffee and the specific tension of a meeting everyone but you seems to have known about in advance. It's 10:02 a.m. on a Thursday. Diane from HR is sitting across the table with a folder in front of her, closed, both hands resting on top of it like she's holding something down. Greg, your direct manager, is next to her, jaw tight, not quite looking at you. You've worked with Greg for 4 years. You've never seen him look like this. We need to talk about your performance, Diane says. She opens the folder. Inside is a printed document with the heading Performance Improvement Summary. 3 bullet points under it, none of them technically wrong, all of them somehow missing the point entirely. Missed 2 deadlines in Q2, limited visibility in cross-functional meetings, not meeting expected engagement benchmarks. You nod slowly. You don't argue. There's no version of arguing that ends well in this room, and you know that from experience, watching other people try it. We've decided to part ways, effective today, Greg says. He slides a termination letter across the table. Signed, dated, official. You look at it for a second. Then you look up at both of them. Okay, you say. Just that. Diane looks slightly thrown by how calm you are. You can see her recalibrating, the way people do when a reaction doesn't match what they expected. Here's what neither of them knows, what almost nobody in this building knows. You own 30% of this company. You don't know that yet either, in the sense that you haven't said it out loud in 3 years. But you know it. You've known it since the wire transfer cleared into the holding account your lawyer set up, back when this company was 11 people crammed into a shared office space above a dry cleaner, and the idea of it succeeding felt, honestly, like a coin flip most days. It started 5 years ago. Marcus, the founder, was a guy you'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue, talking too fast about a logistics software idea that solved a problem you actually understood from your last job. Everyone else had drifted away from him within about 10 minutes, the way people do when someone talks about their startup with too much intensity for a Saturday afternoon. You stayed, partly because 2 sentences into his explanation, you realized he was describing almost exactly a scheduling inefficiency that had cost your previous employer real money for over a year, one nobody there had bothered to fix. By the time the burgers were done, you'd filled half a napkin with a rough sketch of how his system should actually route jobs, and Marcus was looking at you the way people look at something they didn't expect to find at a barbecue. He needed $180,000 to get through the next 18 months of runway, and he needed it from someone who wouldn't panic when things got slow, which they did, repeatedly, in ways that would have scared off almost anyone else. You had $210,000 sitting in an inheritance account from your grandmother that had been doing essentially nothing for 3 years except making your accountant mildly uncomfortable every April. You gave Marcus $150,000 for 25% of the company, structured as a straightforward equity stake. No board seat, no operational involvement, just money and belief.
The condition, which was your idea, not his, was that you'd also come work there. Not as an investor playing dress-up, an actual employee, on payroll, doing real work, invisible to everyone else at the company as anything other than another hire. Marcus thought this was strange. You explained it plainly. You wanted to understand what you'd actually bought, from the inside, not from a quarterly update deck. He agreed, mostly because your money was already in his account, and arguing with you about the terms felt like a bad use of everyone's time. You started as an operations coordinator, $52,000 a year, a real salary, taxed like everyone else's, deposited every 2 weeks into an account that had nothing to do with the equity sitting quietly in a separate holding structure your lawyer managed. For the first 8 months, it was genuinely just a job. You learned the systems, you fixed a scheduling bug that had been costing the company 4 hours a week in manual work. You got a $2,000 raise that came through the normal channels, approved by your manager at the time, a woman named Carol, who left the company 18 months later for reasons that had nothing to do with you. Year 2, the company hit its first real growth stretch. New clients, a small Series A round that diluted your stake from 25% down to 19%, which you'd expected and had modeled in advance with your lawyer, because dilution is just the cost of a company actually growing. You didn't panic about the number going down on paper while the actual value of the stake climbed. Most people conflate percentage with dollar value. You'd stopped doing that math wrong a long time ago. Somewhere in year 2 is also when Greg became your manager. Greg was hired from outside, brought in to build out the operations team properly, a competent guy in most ways. The kind of manager who reads a leadership book every quarter and applies it slightly too literally for a few weeks afterward. Greg liked visible effort. Greg liked people who spoke up first in meetings, who sent the recap email fastest, who seemed to be working the hardest by the metric of seeming. You were never that person. You did your work carefully and quietly and then went home. And in Greg's specific frame of reference, quiet read as disengaged.
There was a specific Tuesday, early in that first year with Greg, that set the tone for everything after it. A cross-functional planning meeting, 12 people on the call, and a colleague named Aaron spent 11 minutes narrating a client integration that, in reality, you had quietly fixed the week before, after his initial version broke a scheduling dependency he hadn't noticed. You didn't correct the record. You sent Aaron a private message afterward with the fix documented, in case he needed it again, and said nothing else. Greg singled Aaron out in the team channel for strong ownership on the integration work. You read it at your desk, felt something small tighten in your chest, and closed the laptop. That was the day you understood, clearly, what kind of currency this office actually traded in. You didn't correct this pattern going forward either. You want to be honest about that part, because it would be easy to make yourself sound like a martyr here, and you weren't. You could have mentioned things. You could have positioned yourself better in meetings, played a little of the game Greg was clearly rewarding. You didn't. Partly out of stubbornness, partly because a strange, private part of you wanted to know what happened to someone at this company who didn't play that game at all. Call it curiosity. Call it an experiment you were running on your own life. Either way, you let it run. Year 3, the company crossed $8 million in annual revenue. Another funding round, another round of dilution, your stake settling at 14% after the math worked itself out. Valuation now sitting north of $40 million based on the last round's terms. You did this math on a Tuesday night at your kitchen table with a calculator app, the way you always did, quietly, alone, and then closed the laptop and went to bed like it was nothing. Because in the specific way that mattered for your actual daily life, at that point, it still mostly was nothing. You still had the $54,000 salary. You still packed lunch. You still drove the same Corolla. Marcus knew. Obviously. Marcus had known since the beginning, since your name was on the cap table in black and white, since your signature was on the shareholder agreement his lawyer had drafted. But Marcus, to his credit, and by explicit agreement between the two of you, never once mentioned it inside the building. Not to Greg, not to Diane, not to anyone. You'd asked him for that specifically in the first month, sitting in his car in the parking lot before your first day. I need this to be real, you told him, not performative. If people know, they'll treat me differently, and I won't actually learn anything. He'd looked at you for a long moment and said, "You're either very smart or you're going to regret this." And you'd said, "Probably both." And that was that. Year 4, a second round of layoffs hit the ops team. 6 people let go in a single week. Cost-cutting ahead of a bigger raise Marcus was courting from a growth equity firm. You survived that round. Not because anyone protected you. Nobody knew there was anything to protect. But because your actual work output, invisible as it was in meetings, was quietly holding together 3 different processes that would have collapsed without you. Greg noticed this in the narrowest possible way. He noted it in a performance review as reliable execution, limited strategic visibility, which is corporate language for, you do the work, but I don't see you doing it, which is corporate language for, I need you to perform effort more visibly than you're doing it. This is also around when Bree joined the team. Junior coordinator, sharp, quiet in her own way. The kind of person Greg similarly underestimated, for similar reasons. The two of you became close, in the manner of two people who recognized the same species of invisibility in each other. You developed a kind of shorthand, a look across the room during meetings that meant, this again. You covered for her once when she missed a deadline during a family emergency, quietly redistributing her workload without telling Greg the real reason. She never forgot that. You never told her about the equity, though. You told her almost everything else over years of lunch breaks and late Friday debriefs, but not that. Some things you keep in a separate room, even from people you trust.
Year 5. This year, the one you're sitting in the conference room for right now, the company crossed $22 million in revenue and closed a Series B that valued it at $110 million. Your stake, after 4 rounds of dilution, had settled at exactly 30% because you'd bought back a departing early employee shares 18 months earlier through the holding company, quietly through your lawyer. A transaction that appeared on paperwork as an internal share transfer and meant nothing to anyone at the company except a line item nobody read closely. 30% of $110 million. You did that math too, the same way, alone, at the same kitchen table, on the same calculator app. And then you closed the laptop and went to bed, because the number, however large, still didn't change what Tuesday morning at the office actually looked like.
What it looked like, apparently, was Greg building a performance improvement plan file on you over the preceding 2 quarters. Missed deadlines that were, in reality, deadlines shifted by other teams that never got logged as such. Limited visibility in cross-functional meetings, which was accurate, because you genuinely stopped caring whether Greg saw you as ambitious, since your actual ambitions had nothing to do with this specific job title. Engagement benchmarks, a metric invented 18 months earlier by a consultant Greg had hired that measured things like Slack response time and meeting camera usage, neither of which you'd ever taken seriously.
So here you are. Diane's folder is still open on the table. Greg's termination letter is still sitting in front of you, unsigned by your hand. Waiting. I understand, you say. Can I ask one question before I sign anything? Diane nods, professional, expecting a negotiation about severance, probably, or a question about Cobra. Has Marcus seen this, you ask? Something in Greg's face shifts, a small flicker of confusion. This is an HR matter, Diane says carefully. Marcus doesn't need to be looped in on individual performance decisions. He'll want to be, you say. Can you get him on a call? Right now, if he's around. There's a pause. Diane looks at Greg. Greg looks at his phone. 10 minutes later, Marcus is on a video call, dialing in from his office 2 floors up, visibly confused about why he's being pulled into what should be a routine termination. What's going on? Marcus says. And you can hear underneath the words that he already suspects, because Marcus is not a stupid man. And the two of you have had a version of this conversation hypothetically years ago, half joking, about what would happen if this exact scenario ever came up. Greg and Diane are terminating my employment, you say, evenly, for underperformance. Marcus is quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he says, you should probably tell them about the cap table. Diane's expression is the first thing to move. It happens in stages, the way it always does when something reorganizes itself behind someone's eyes. First confusion, then a kind of protective skepticism, like she's waiting for the punchline. Then, when Marcus starts explaining, plainly, without embellishment, that you hold a 30% ownership stake in the company, acquired over 5 years, fully documented, fully legal, entirely separate from your role as an employee, her face does the thing faces do when a person realizes they've been standing on ground that isn't where they thought it was. Greg says nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, the engagement benchmarks. Yeah, you say, not unkindly. I never really cared about those.
Diane closes the folder. She doesn't apologize immediately because she's smart enough to know an apology right now would sound like it's about the money, not about the mistake, and she wants to get that distinction right before she says anything. Instead, she says, I think we need to restart this conversation entirely.
We do, Marcus says from the screen. And Diane, this isn't about protecting anyone from consequences. If there's a real performance issue, it gets addressed like a real performance issue. But it doesn't get addressed by two people who didn't know who they were talking to. You sit there for a moment in the quiet after that, and you feel something you hadn't expected to feel, which is not vindication exactly, and not satisfaction either. It's closer to the relief of an experiment finally concluding. 5 years of being genuinely, deliberately invisible, just to see what that costs a person inside a company that doesn't know who's actually sitting at the table. Now you know.
The severance conversation, when it eventually happens weeks later, is calm and procedural, mostly beside the point, because you'd never planned to make this your only income anyway. You stay on, technically, in a different, quieter capacity, mostly advisory now. Still driving the same Corolla, still packing lunch, and Greg, to his actual credit, comes to your desk 2 days later and says, simply, I owe you a real conversation when you're ready for one. You tell him you're ready now. It's a good conversation. Awkward at first, honest by the end. He admits he genuinely thought quiet meant coasting, that nobody had taught him another way to measure it. Neither of you pretends it fixes 5 years of misread signals. It doesn't. But it's honest, and that matters more than you expected.
Bree finds out eventually the way these things travel through a building, no matter how carefully you try to contain them. She corners you by the coffee machine a few weeks later, and all she says is, you could have told me. You tell her the truth, that it was never about her, that it was about needing one place in your life where nobody was performing anything for anyone. She thinks about that, then says, fair. And that's the end of it. She starts, very slightly, treating your quietness like it might mean something other than disengagement, which was really all you'd ever wanted from any of this. Not applause, just the benefit of the doubt. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. It was never about proving Greg wrong. It was about understanding from the inside what a company actually looks like to the people who don't hold any leverage in it. The ones whose invisibility isn't a choice, isn't an experiment they get to end whenever they want. You got to run this as a 5-year test with an exit built in. Most people at that company didn't. That's the number that actually sat with you longer than the 30%. You still drive the Corolla. You still pack lunch. Some Tuesdays, you forget for whole stretches of the afternoon what any of it is worth on paper. That part, more than the money, is the thing you were never willing to give up.